On June 9, 2008, police discovered an abandoned SUV in the middle of the night on Bear Mountain Bridge in New York. Its owner was Sam Israel III, a hedge fund manager who had just been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for a massive financial fraud that cost investors hundreds of millions of dollars. Written on the hood was a single chilling message: "Suicide is painless." Investigators immediately believed he had jumped into the Hudson River to take his own life rather than face his prison sentence. But after days of searching, not a single body was ever found. The truth slowly emerged. This wasn't a suicide. It was a carefully planned fake death designed to deceive the FBI and disappear before reporting to prison. But what drove a man who once managed hundreds of millions of dollars for American investors to take such a desperate risk? To understand the answer, we have to go back to where it all began. And if you enjoy true stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the rest of this incredible true case. To understand how Sam Israel III came to be behind one of the most notorious hedge fund frauds in American history, we have to go back long before the Bayou Hedge Fund ever existed. Samuel Israel III was born in 1959 in New Orleans, Louisiana, into a family with a long history in commodities and finance. He didn't grow up as a stranger to money or investing. The world of trading, financial markets, and large sums of money had surrounded his family long before he ever set foot on Wall Street. As he grew older, Israel chose to pursue a career in finance. He entered the world of professional trading, where a single decision could make, or wipe out, millions of dollars in a matter of moments. During his years in the markets, Israel learned how to track price movements, manage positions, and accept levels of risk that most ordinary people would never have to face. Worked with Frederick J. Graeber, a trader who would later become an important figure in the Bayou story. Over time, Israel built the experience and connections that gave him the confidence to believe he could manage other people's money rather than simply trade for a firm. Why the mid-1990s? Israel wanted a fund of his own. In 1996, Sam Israel and Daniel Marino, an accountant, founded the Bayou Hedge Fund Group in Connecticut. The original goal was straightforward: raise money from investors, trade in the financial markets, and generate enough returns to build Bayou into a successful hedge fund. But almost from the beginning, the trading results didn't go the way Israel had hoped. Money began disappearing. And Sam Israel was about to face the most important decision of his life: admit the losses to his investors, or find a way to make them believe Bayou was still making money. In 1996, Bayou Hedge Fund began operating with the goal of building a hedge fund capable of generating consistent returns for its investors. But it didn't take long for Sam Israel III to face something he didn't want to admit. The actual trading results were nothing like what he had expected. Bayou was losing money. For a newly established hedge fund, those losses didn't just reduce its capital. If investors learned the truth, they could withdraw their money, refuse to invest more, and bring Bayou's future to an end before the fund ever had a chance to grow. Israel and Daniel Marino, who handled the fund's finances, faced a very clear choice: report the losses exactly as they occurred or hide them. They chose the second option. Bayou began sending investors reports showing results that were better than reality. Losses were concealed, while the fund's performance was presented as though its trading operations were still generating profits. But one major problem remained: a fund managing investors' money needed financial statements credible enough to maintain their trust. If a truly independent auditor carefully examined Bayou's books, the difference between what investors were being told and what was actually happening could be exposed. Rather than allow that to happen, Marino created an accounting firm called Richmond Fairfield Associates. The firm was presented to investors as an independent auditor, but in reality, it was controlled by people connected to Bayou itself. From that point forward, the audit reports could confirm whatever numbers Bayou wanted its investors to see. Israel was no longer simply a trader trying to recover from a series of losses. Every misleading report forced him to protect the lie that came before it. And while investors believed their money was growing, the gap between Bayou's image of success and its actual financial condition continued to widen. Once the system for hiding the losses was in place, Sam Israel III didn't shut Bayou down. Instead, the fund continued looking for new money. Over the next several years, Bayou built the image of a hedge fund capable of delivering consistent returns. The numbers presented to investors made them believe that Sam Israel had the trading operation under control and that their money was being managed successfully. That confidence brought more capital into Bayou. New investors came in, while those who had already invested had every reason to keep their money in the fund. As the amount of capital increased, Israel had more money to trade with, but at the same time, he also had to maintain the image of success Bayou had created. The pressure began to grow. Israel continued trying to recover what had been lost through trading, but whenever the actual results failed to match what investors had been told, the gap between the two sets of numbers grew even wider by the early 2000s. Bayou was no longer a small hedge fund struggling to establish itself. The company had attracted hundreds of millions of dollars from investors. From the outside, that growth made Bayou look successful. But inside the fund, Israel was facing an increasingly dangerous problem. The amount of money Bayou actually had did not match the value investors had been led to believe they owned, needed trading profits large enough to close the gap. But those profits never came. Instead of ending the scheme, Bayou continued to expand. More money was raised, more accounts had to be managed, and increasingly larger numbers had to be maintained. Israel was no longer simply trying to save a struggling investment fund. He was trying to keep the entire structure from collapsing. And with hundreds of millions of dollars now tied up in the Bayou system, all it would take was for investors to start demanding their money back for everything Israel had spent years trying to hide to finally be exposed. By 2004, Bayou's problems had entered a much more dangerous stage. Sam Israel III was no longer simply trying to keep a massive hedge fund running. He was beginning to face real pressure as some investors wanted to pull their money out of the fund. Every redemption request meant Bayou needed actual cash to pay investors back, and that was becoming increasingly difficult for Israel to manage. As the pressure mounted, Israel began looking for other ways to generate enough money to solve Bayou's growing problems. He moved tens of millions of dollars into outside investment deals, hoping they would produce enormous returns. But instead of saving the fund, those decisions placed even more of Bayou's money at risk. By 2005, Israel began talking about shutting down the Bayou funds and returning investors' capital. This was the moment when the promises on paper had to face one very simple question. How much money did Bayou actually have available to pay investors back? As investors waited for their money to be returned, some did not receive what they had expected. Questions began to surface. Phone calls and demands for explanations became increasingly difficult to avoid. Israel was no longer simply trying to keep Bayou operating. He now had to find enough money to meet obligations the fund had accumulated over years. By the middle of 2005, the pressure was approaching its breaking point. Then something happened outside Bayou's offices. A suspicious banking transaction involving approximately $100 million caught the attention of authorities. This time, the problem was no longer entirely within Sam Israel's control. Door into Bayou's secrets had just begun to open. By mid-2005, Bayou could no longer maintain the appearance of stability it had projected for years. After Sam Israel III announced plans to shut down the funds and return investors' capital, investors began waiting for their money. But when the payments failed to arrive as expected, suspicion quickly grew. Some investors demanded explanations, while others directly demanded their money back. Israel was now facing what he had spent years trying to avoid. The numbers on the reports had to be backed by real money. When Bayou could no longer fully meet those demands, the structure Israel and Daniel Marino had maintained began to collapse. Outside scrutiny quickly turned into a serious investigation. The SEC and federal law enforcement authorities began examining Bayou's operations. Investigators collected bank records, trading documents, reports sent to investors, and materials related to the fund's auditing activities. When those records were compared side by side, the inconsistencies became increasingly difficult to hide. The investigation also turned its attention to Richmond Fairfield Associates, the firm that had served as Bayou's auditor but was, in reality, directly connected to Daniel Marino. Documents that had once helped Bayou create an appearance of credibility were now becoming part of the evidence against the people running the fund. Investigators continued following the money and uncovered a massive gap between the results Bayou had reported and its true financial condition. By this point, there was no way for Israel to return Bayou to normal operations. The fund had collapsed, investors were facing enormous losses, and the federal investigation was closing in on the people behind the entire operation. After nearly a decade of hiding the truth, Sam Israel III no longer had to figure out how to save Bayou. He now had to prepare for a much greater threat: federal criminal prosecution. After Bayou collapsed, Sam Israel III could no longer solve his problems with financial reports or numbers created inside the fund. On September 29, 2005, Israel pleaded guilty to federal charges of conspiracy, investment advisor fraud, and mail fraud. Daniel Marino also pleaded guilty that same day. With that guilty plea, Israel formally admitted his role in the scheme that had convinced investors to put more than $450 million into the Bayou funds. The false financial statements and fabricated investment results that had once helped keep Bayou alive were now part of the case against the people who ran it. The actual losses suffered by investors were later determined to be approximately $300 million. Israel then had to wait more than 2 years to learn the price he would pay. On April 14, 2008, he appeared in federal court in Manhattan to hear his sentence. U.S. District Judge Colleen McMahon determined that Israel had been the mastermind behind the Bayou fraud. The sentence: 20 years in federal prison. In addition to the prison sentence, Israel was ordered to pay $300 million in restitution to the victims of the Bayou fraud. Daniel Marino was also sentenced to 20 years in prison after years of running a hedge fund that once managed hundreds of millions of dollars. Sam Israel was now facing the prospect of spending a significant portion of his life behind bars. The court ordered him to report to prison on June 9, 2008, to begin serving his sentence. But as that date approached, Israel wasn't preparing to walk into prison the way the court had ordered. Instead, he began preparing one final plan, a plan that would make people believe Sam Israel III was dead. On June 9, 2008, Sam Israel III was supposed to surrender and begin serving his 20-year federal prison sentence. But the deadline came and went, and Sam never showed up. That same day, his GMC Envoy was discovered abandoned near the Bear Mountain Bridge, north of New York City. Written on the vehicle was a haunting message: "Suicide is painless." The scene immediately suggested a disturbing possibility. Sam may have jumped from the bridge into the Hudson River. Authorities responded quickly. The area around the bridge and the water below were searched, but Sam's body was nowhere to be found. The longer the search continued, the bigger the question became: if he had really jumped, why was there no evidence confirming it? Once Sam failed to surrender as ordered by the court, the case was no longer simply a missing person investigation. The FBI joined the search, while other law enforcement agencies worked to track down the man who had just been sentenced for his role in one of the largest hedge fund fraud schemes in American history. Agents began examining everything Sam had left behind. The vehicle at the bridge, the suicide message, and his actions leading up to his disappearance all came under scrutiny. The theory that Sam was dead now had to compete with a far more troubling possibility: Sam Israel III was still alive, and everything on that bridge had been staged. The search changed direction. Instead of only looking into the Hudson River, investigators began searching for a fugitive. Sam had bought himself time by forcing everyone to question whether he was even still alive. But that time wouldn't last forever. As the FBI and other law enforcement agencies continued following the trail, Sam's plan to disappear began to unravel. The man who had once used fake numbers to hide the truth at Bayou was now using a fake death to hide himself. And this time, the people behind him weren't investors demanding their money back. Once investigators concluded that Sam Israel III might still be alive, the case entered an entirely different phase. He was no longer being searched for as a missing person. Sam was now a federal fugitive who had failed to report for his prison sentence, and the manhunt began to expand. The FBI and the U.S. Marshal Service worked with other law enforcement agencies to track him down. Information about Sam was distributed to the appropriate authorities, while investigators examined locations and personal connections that might help determine where he was hiding. But Sam hadn't fled to some distant country. After disappearing, he remained in the New York area and tried to avoid detection by law enforcement. Every day that passed increased the chances that someone would recognize him. His life on the run lasted only about 3 weeks. On July 2, 2008, Sam surfaced in Southwick, Massachusetts. Instead of continuing to hide, he walked into a local police station and turned himself in. The man who had forced authorities to question whether he was alive or dead had now voluntarily placed himself back in the hands of the law. Local police quickly confirmed Sam's identity and took him into custody. Federal authorities who had been searching for him were notified. The manhunt that began when he failed to surrender on June 9 was finally over. But turning himself in didn't erase the consequences of his disappearance. Sam was already facing a 20-year federal prison sentence for the Bayou fraud. Now, deliberately failing to surrender and going on the run had created an entirely new federal case. He was returned to the justice system, where the staged suicide at the bridge was no longer a mystery. It was evidence of an attempt to escape prison. Sam Israel III had failed to disappear. And this time, when the doors of federal custody closed behind him, he would have to pay not only for Bayou, but for his escape attempt as well. Sam Israel III's surrender did not erase the consequences of his attempt to disappear. He was already facing a 20-year federal prison sentence for his role in the Bayou fraud. But his decision to fail to report to prison and deliberately vanish brought an entirely new criminal case against him. Sam later pleaded guilty to failing to surrender to serve his sentence. In July 2009, a federal court sentenced him to an additional 2 years in prison, to be served consecutively to his original 20-year sentence. That brought his total prison term to 22 years, but Sam's sentence was only one part of the damage left behind by Bayou. Over the years, hundreds of millions of dollars have been placed into the Bayou funds by investors who believed they were putting their money into a successful investment operation. When the truth was finally exposed, approximately $300 million in investor money had been lost. The court also ordered Sam to pay restitution in a corresponding amount to the victims. After the case concluded, the federal government continued recovering assets connected to Bayou in an effort to return money to the victims. But recovering part of the money could never undo what had already happened. Bayou had been built to look like a professional investment fund. But behind that image were hidden trading losses, reports that did not reflect reality, and a system sustained by convincing investors that the fund was performing far better than it actually was. When that system finally collapsed, Sam Israel made one more attempt to escape the consequences. This time, he wasn't hiding the numbers. He was trying to hide himself. But both schemes ended the same way. Bayou was exposed. Sam was convicted. His disappearance failed. And the man who had once controlled hundreds of millions of dollars ultimately found himself spending years inside a federal prison. That was the final price of Bayou, a fraud that survived for years, but could never survive forever. The Yendi.